I know that sounds crazy coming from me. I know people are going to think I've lost my mind, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. 3 weeks ago, I was ready to end it all. Not my empire, my life. I was sitting in my penthouse at 3 a.m., staring at a bottle of pills, feeling more alone than I had ever felt. The weight of everything was crushing me. Every decision, every scandal, every person I had used and discarded. I had everything the world said I should want: money, fame, power, influence. People looked at me and saw success, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw a man who was dying inside. The pressure was unbelievable. The parties, the deals, the constant performance. No time for real relationships. No time for genuine connection. No time for my own soul. I was running on ego and substances, making decisions that affected countless lives while I was barely holding myself together. I remember the last real conversation I had with my son. He asked me to just talk to him. Really talk. Not about business or image or money. I promised I would make time. But then another crisis came up. Another opportunity one couldn't miss. The hurt in his eyes when I chose work over him again still haunts me. That night, alone in my penthouse, I made a list. All the people I had manipulated, all the trust one had broken, all the lives I had damaged in my climb to the top. The list was longer than I expected. I had become everything I used to criticize. The mogul who thought power could solve everything. The boss who demanded loyalty but gave none in return. The father who was too busy building an empire to build relationships with his own children. So I picked up that bottle of pills. I was about to take them when I saw it. A small leather-bound book sitting on my coffee table. A Bible. I had no idea how it got there. My security team swore they didn't put it there. The cameras showed no one entering my penthouse. But there it was, like it had been waiting for me. I opened it randomly and the first thing I read was about a man who had everything but felt empty. A man who was searching for something real. It was the story of Jesus talking to a rich young ruler. The man had followed all the rules, done everything right, accumulated wealth and status, but he still felt empty. Jesus told him to give up everything and follow him. I read that story 5 times. Each time I felt like I was looking in a mirror. Here was a man who had achieved everything the world said mattered, but he was still searching for something more. I stayed up all night reading stories about people who gave up everything for something better. People who found meaning in sacrifice. People who discovered that the things they thought mattered most were actually the things holding them back. By sunrise, I had made my decision, not to take the pills, not to end my life, but to end the life I had been living. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing, figuring out how to transition everything, how to make sure the people depending on me would be okay, how to do this right, but I knew there was no going back. I had seen what my life really was. Empty, meaningless, a prison made of gold and platinum. I called my mother that morning. I hadn't talked to her in months. I told her about the book, about the decision I was making, about the path I was choosing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she started crying. "I've been praying for this day for 20 years, she said. "I've been praying that you would find your way back to God." "You never told me," I said. "I couldn't," she said. "You had to find your own way. You had to make your own choice." She told me about the prayers she had been saying, the candles she had been lighting, the hope she had been holding onto even when I seemed completely lost. "Your father would be proud," she said. "He always believed you would find your way back to what really matters." That's when I knew I was making the right choice. Not the easy choice. Not the choice that made sense to everyone else, but the right choice. Let me tell you about the night that changed everything. The night I almost ended it all. I had been working for 40 hours straight. The pressure was crushing. Every decision felt like it could make or break everything. I was responsible for hundreds of employees, millions in revenue, and the dreams of countless artists and creators who believed in what we were building. But I was breaking. I stood in my penthouse looking out at the city lights, feeling more alone than I had ever felt. The success that everyone envied felt like a prison. The money that was supposed to solve all problems had created new ones. The fame that was supposed to validate my worth had become a spotlight that never turned off. I opened my desk drawer and stared at the pills inside. Not the ones doctors had prescribed for my anxiety. Different ones. Ones that would make everything stop. I sat there for 3 hours just staring at those pills, thinking about how tired I was, how empty everything felt, how I had lost myself somewhere along the way. I kept thinking about my children, about the kind of father I had become. Always networking, always performing, always promising I'd make more time later, but later never came. I thought about my relationships. about how I had treated people like commodities to be used and discarded. I had become the kind of person I would have hated knowing. I thought about my dreams when I was younger. I'd wanted to create culture, to elevate people, to make the world more beautiful, but somewhere along the way, I'd become obsessed with being powerful instead of being purposeful. The pills were right there. It would have been so easy. One decision and all the pressure would stop. All the performance would be over. All the pain would end. But then I saw the book. The Bible was sitting right there on my table like it had been waiting for me. I still can't explain how it got there, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. I opened it randomly and my eyes fell on the story of the rich young ruler. This man had everything: wealth, status, respect, but he was still searching for something more. He came to Jesus asking what he needed to do to inherit eternal life. Jesus told him to sell everything he had and give it to the poor. Then come and follow him. The man walked away sad because he had great wealth. I read that story over and over. Here was someone who had achieved everything I had achieved, but he was still empty, still searching, still unfulfilled. And Jesus offered him something different. Not more success, not more wealth, not more recognition. He offered him a life of meaning, a life of purpose, a life of service, but it required giving up everything. I kept reading story after story of people who had encountered Jesus and had their lives completely transformed, not by gaining more, but by giving up everything they thought they needed. The fishermen who left their nets, the tax collector who walked away from his profitable business, the woman who poured expensive perfume on Jesus' feet instead of selling it. All of them had made the same choice. They had given up their old lives to follow Jesus. As I read, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not hope for more success or more money or more recognition. Hope for something real, something that mattered. I realized that I had been living like that rich young ruler. I had everything the world said I should want, but I was still empty, still searching, still unfulfilled. And now I was being offered the same choice: give up everything and follow Jesus, or walk away sad like the rich young ruler did. I made my decision that night. I put the pills away. I closed the book and I started planning how to change my life completely. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to make sense to most people, but it was the only choice that felt real. The days after finding that book were unlike anything I had ever experienced. I couldn't stop reading. I couldn't stop thinking. I couldn't stop feeling like my entire life had been turned upside down. I started with the Gospels, the stories of Jesus. I had heard them before. Of course, my grandmother had taken me to church when I was young, but I had never really listened. Not like this. What struck me most was how Jesus talked about money and success. He didn't just ignore these things. He actively warned against them. He said it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He told people to store up treasures in heaven, not on earth. He said you couldn't serve both God and money. He praised the poor and warned the rich. Everything I had spent my life pursuing, Jesus seemed to be saying was dangerous, not just unimportant, dangerous. I started looking at my life differently. The constant parties, the endless networking, the never-ending pursuit of more influence. I had thought I was being successful, being a mogul, being a leader. But what if I was just being selfish? What if all my achievements were just elaborate ways of serving myself instead of serving others? I thought about the artists I worked with. Yes, I was helping their careers, but I was also taking most of their profits, their creativity, their talent, their dreams. And for what? So I could be richer, so I could be more powerful. I thought about the innovations we were creating. Yes, they were impressive, but were they really making the world better? Or were they just making me more famous? I thought about the money I was making. Yes, it was a lot, but what was I doing with it? Most of it was just sitting there, growing, becoming more money. It wasn't feeding hungry people or housing the homeless or healing the sick. The more I read, the more I realized that Jesus wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about a completely different way of living, a way of living that put others first, that valued service over success, that measured worth by how much you gave rather than how much you got. I started praying. I hadn't prayed in years, maybe decades, but I found myself talking to God like I was talking to a friend, asking questions, admitting my failures, asking for guidance. And slowly, I started getting answers, not audible voices or miraculous signs, but a growing sense of what I needed to do. I needed to give it all up, not just some of it, not just the excess, all of it, everything that was keeping me from following Jesus completely. The idea terrified me. How could I give up everything I had worked for? How could I disappoint all the people who depended on me? How could I throw away all the opportunities one had created? But then I remembered the rich young ruler. He had walked away sad because he couldn't give up his wealth, and Jesus had let him go. He hadn't chased after him or offered him a compromise. He had given him a choice, and the man had chosen his possessions over eternal life. I didn't want to be that man. I didn't want to walk away sad. I didn't want to choose my possessions over my soul. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I decided to give it all up. I started making plans, how to transition my responsibilities, how to ensure that the people depending on me would be taken care of, how to give away my wealth in ways that would actually help people. I knew it was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done, harder than starting my first business, harder than dealing with failure, harder than building an empire from nothing. But I also knew it was the only thing that would save me. I had found the book at exactly the right moment. When I was ready to give up on life, I had found a reason to live, not the life I had been living, but a new life, a life of meaning, a life of purpose, a life of following Jesus. The first person I told was my mother. I called her at 7 a.m., knowing she would be awake, knowing she would understand. "Mom," I said, "I need to tell you something. I'm giving it all up, everything. I'm going to follow Jesus." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard her crying. "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years, she said. "I've been praying for this every single day. Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because I knew you had to find your own way. I knew God would reach you when you were ready." We talked for 3 hours. She told me about the prayers she had been saying, the faith she had been holding on to, the hope she had carried even when I seemed completely lost. "Your father would be so proud," she said. "He always believed you would find your way back to what really matters." The next person I told was my longtime assistant, Marcus. He had been with me for 10 years, and I knew this decision would affect him directly. "Marcus," I said, "I need to ask you something. If you could do anything with your life, anything at all, what would it be?" He looked surprised. "I don't know. I've never really thought about it." "Think about it now." He was quiet for a moment. "I guess I always wanted to be a social worker. I wanted to help families, but I needed a job that paid well, and this opportunity came up. What if I told you that you could go back to school, get your degree, and I would pay for everything? Your education, your living expenses, everything?" His eyes widened. "I don't understand. I'm making some major changes in my life, and I want to make sure the people who have been loyal to me have the chance to pursue their dreams too." That's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about me giving up my wealth. It was about using my wealth to help other people find their purpose too. I spent the next week meeting with key people in my life, not to get their permission. I had already made my decision, but to explain what I was doing and to figure out how to help them transition. Some people understood. My youngest son seemed relieved that I would finally have time for real conversations. My mother cried with joy when I told her about the foundation I was creating. But others didn't understand. Some of my oldest friends thought I was having a breakdown. Some business associates felt betrayed. Some employees worried about their jobs. The media started catching wind of what was happening. Reporters were calling, asking for interviews, trying to understand what was going on. Stock prices started fluctuating. Competitors started circling. But I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I was scared. Yes, I was uncertain about the future, but I wasn't anxious. I wasn't stressed. I wasn't lying awake at night worrying about deals and consequences. For the first time in decades, I was sleeping through the night. I kept reading the Bible. I kept praying. I kept feeling more and more certain that this was the right path. I read about the apostles who had given up everything to follow Jesus. I read about early Christians who had shared everything in common. I read about saints throughout history who had chosen poverty and service over wealth and power. I wasn't trying to become a saint. I was just trying to become human again. I started visiting places I had never been before. Homeless shelters, food banks, community centers in poor neighborhoods. I wanted to understand what I had been missing while I was focused on building my empire. What I found was people who had very little but who seemed to have something I'd lost. Community, purpose, hope. They were helping each other. They were making a difference in small ways. They were living lives that mattered. I started volunteering, not as a publicity stunt. I asked them not to tell anyone who I was. I just wanted to serve, to help, to do something useful with my hands instead of just moving money around. It felt incredible. For the first time in years, I went to bed knowing that I had actually helped someone, not helped them make money or become more successful, helped them eat, helped them find shelter, helped them feel less alone. This is what Jesus had been talking about. This is what I had been missing. The transition took 8 months. 8 months of the hardest work I had ever done. Not hard because it was complicated, but hard because it meant letting go of everything I had built my identity around. I had to tell my children what I was doing. That was one of the hardest conversations of my life. "Dad, are you sure about this?" my oldest asked. "Are you sure you're not just going through a phase?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I told him. "I know it seems crazy. I know it doesn't make sense from the outside, but I found something I've been searching for my whole life." "What's that?" "Purpose. Real purpose. Not just making money or building companies or impressing people. Actually making a difference." My youngest son had a different reaction. "Does this mean you'll finally have time to really talk to me?" "Yes," I said. "It means I'll finally have time for the things that really matter." The business side of the transition was incredibly complex. Lawyers, accountants, tax specialists, all working to figure out how to transfer hundreds of millions of dollars in assets while taking care of employees, investors, and artists. I decided to give most of it away, not to one big charity, but to hundreds of small organizations that were doing real work in their communities: food banks, homeless shelters, schools in poor neighborhoods, clinics that served uninsured patients. I kept enough to live comfortably but simply: a modest house, a reliable car, enough savings to cover basic needs. Everything else went to people who needed it more than I did. The media had a field day. Headlines about my breakdown and midlife crisis appeared everywhere. Stock prices went crazy. Competitors tried to take advantage of the chaos. But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what people thought about me. I didn't care about my reputation or my image or my legacy. I cared about following Jesus, and Jesus had never seemed to care much about what people thought of him either. The hardest part was the loneliness. Many of my old friends stopped calling. People I had known for years acted like I had betrayed them. Business associates avoided me at public events. I had thought these people were my friends, but I realized they were friends with my success, not with me. When I gave up the success, I lost the friends. But I also gained something: time, real time, time to read, to think, to pray, to spend with my family, time to volunteer, to serve, to help people who needed help. I started teaching a class at a community center, entrepreneurship for teenagers from low-income families, not teaching them how to get rich, but teaching them how to use business skills to serve their communities. I loved it. These kids had hope, energy, creativity. They wanted to make a difference. They reminded me of who I used to be before I got obsessed with success. "Mr. Combs," one of them asked, "why did you give up all your money?" "Because I realized money wasn't making me happy," I told him, "and I realized that having money while other people were suffering wasn't making me a good person." "But couldn't you have kept some of it and still helped people?" "Maybe," I said, "but I needed to prove to myself that I could give it up. I needed to know that I wasn't controlled by my possessions." "Are you happier now?" I thought about the question. I was living in a smaller house, driving an older car, wearing clothes I had bought at regular stores instead of having them custom made. I wasn't flying on private jets or eating at expensive restaurants or staying in luxury hotels. But I was sleeping through the night. I was spending time with my children. I was helping people who really needed help. I was reading books that mattered instead of just contracts and projections. "Yes," I said, "I'm happier now than I've ever been." A year after I made my decision, I was standing in a small church in Brooklyn, getting ready to be baptized, not because I had to be, but because I wanted to be, because I wanted to make a public declaration of my commitment to following Jesus. The church was full of people I had met over the past year, people from the homeless shelter where I volunteered, kids from the community center where I taught, neighbors from my new neighborhood, which wasn't gated and didn't have security guards. My mother was there, crying with joy. My children were there, still trying to understand what had happened to their father but beginning to see that he was happier than he had been in years. The pastor, a man named David who had been serving this community for 25 years, asked me to share my story with the congregation. "A year ago, I was one of the most successful people in the entertainment industry," I said. "I had everything money could buy, but I was dying inside. I was empty, lonely, and desperate. Then I found a book, a Bible, and I read about a rich young ruler who walked away sad because he couldn't give up his wealth to follow Jesus. I decided I didn't want to be that man, so I gave it all up, not because I hated money, but because I loved Jesus more, and I can tell you today that it was the best decision I ever made." The applause was different from the applause I used to get at award shows. It wasn't about admiration or envy. It was about joy. People were happy for me, not because I had achieved something impressive, but because I had found something real. After the service, I walked through the neighborhood, past houses where families were living in homes built with money I had donated, past the community garden that was growing food for people who couldn't afford groceries, past the small clinic that was providing healthcare for people without insurance. This was my legacy now, not record labels or nightclubs or stock prices. People, real people living better lives because I had chosen to follow Jesus instead of following success. I stopped at a small restaurant owned by a woman named Maria who had started the business with a loan from one of the funds I had established. She was working behind the counter, serving food to construction workers and teachers and retirees. "How's business?" I asked. "Good," she said. "Really good. I never thought I'd be able to own my own restaurant, but here I am." "How does it feel?" "Like I'm finally doing what I was meant to do," she said. "Like I'm contributing something to the world." I knew exactly what she meant. That evening, I sat in my backyard reading the Bible that had changed my life. It was still the same book, still the same words, but now I understood them differently. Now I knew what it meant to follow Jesus. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being willing to give up everything that stood between you and God. For some people, that might mean giving up a bad habit or a toxic relationship. For me, it meant giving up hundreds of millions of dollars and a life of luxury. But the cost was nothing compared to what I had gained. I had gained a relationship with God. I had gained peace. I had gained purpose. I had gained the ability to sleep at night knowing that my life was making a difference. My phone buzzed. A text from my youngest son. "Dad, I'm proud of you." That was worth more than all the money I'd ever made. This is my story. This is what it means to risk it all for Jesus Christ, and it's the best decision I ever made.